بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I know y'all been fasting all day, but you can give me a better salam than that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good. Alhamdulillah. Mashallah. When you get an introduction that talks about how great you are, you're afraid that it's a prelude to your eulogy. Inshallah, may Allah give us good health and long life so that we can be around to see next year's Ramadan. Inshallah. Last year when I was here speaking to commemorate the loss of our brother and teacher, the martyr, Alhaj Malik Shabazz Malcolm X, I told y'all a story about my experience with Malcolm, and I'm going to repeat just a little bit of that, but I'm going to focus on some different themes in Malcolm's story. As Sister Aisha, and may Allah reward her and her husband and her whole family for all of the tireless efforts that she expends in the service of Islam. She set the table really nicely for us in reminding us about fear and about grief. And about the struggle against fear and grief. Malcolm's autobiography begins with his expressions of fear and grief. The very first pages of Malcolm's autobiography is a discussion of when his mother is pregnant with him, the Klan threatening her life. It's about his experience seeing his father murdered by the Black Legion or the Klan. It's a story of grief, and it's also a story of Malcolm's fear. Malcolm says, I have always believed that in the end I will die by violence. He tells a story that starts with a child in a fragile place. He tells a story about watching his father put hands on his mother. And you can imagine this frightened child living in this world surrounded by violence, surrounded by fear, and growing up with all this grief. And you see what that grief and that fear does to the man that Malcolm becomes in his teen years, in his 20s. Everything that he's lived through, everything that he suffers, he starts to self-medicate. He starts to seek out the love that he has been denied by a hateful world in all the wrong places. But part of the beauty of the autobiography of Malcolm X is that it is an everlasting testament to the fact that no matter how dark the place that you are in is, Allah can find you there and rescue you. In this day and age, we perform a holier than thou Islam. What makes Malcolm's story so powerful is that he is truthful about everything that he went through. And it makes his testimony that much more powerful. And that is the testimony that brought me to Islam when I was 15 years old. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X in one night, cover to cover. The next day, I went into my school library and I checked out an English translation of the Quran, and I read that cover to cover. And then I slept through my alarm and missed my school bus. and I told my mother that I'm Muslim and I want to make my shahada. And that's what happened. But I'm going to tell you a story now that is about Malcolm's story. The way that I talked about it last year was about the struggle for racial justice. And I talked about racism as the religion of the shaitan, and I also talked about character and the development of character, the 7 beloved traits of character in the Quran, as the antidote to a lot of our social ills. This year I'm going to talk about Malcolm's story as a story of a voyage for knowledge of Allah. And I will say that that book is the single most powerful work in the English language that tells the story of a spiritual journey, of a spiritual suluk, of wayfaring, traveling, seeking out God. And I'm going to open up to you guys and tell you my story and why Malcolm's autobiography and the Quran translation that I read when I was 15 resonated so much with me. Because I also came up in dark places. I also saw my father put hands on my mother. And in the same apartment building in DC where I saw my father beat my mother to probably within a few inches of her life, I had a recurrent dream. And I'll never forget this dream as long as I live. I remember feeling when I woke up from this dream that I had been asleep for years. And in the dream, barakallah fiik. In the dream, I was a bodiless entity floating from the beginning of time. And that's why it took so long to wake up from the dream. I felt like I had been asleep for years. I just kept moving and moving and moving and moving. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I see a concrete wall. Everywhere I look up, everywhere I look down, everywhere I look right, everywhere I look left, there's this wall. I can't go any further. My travel has reached its end. And then I'm quiet inside myself, a 7-year-old boy, and I feel a presence on the other side of that wall. Something is on the other side, and it never stops. It just goes on forever. And all I could think was that whatever's on the other side of that wall is indivisible. It can't be divided into parts. It can't be separated into pieces. And when I washed the cold from my eyes the next morning and explained to my mama the dream, I said, Mama, that wall was 40 foot thick of concrete and paper thin at the same time. Imagine the paradox of a 7-year-old trying to explain what he means by 40 foot thick of concrete and paper thin at the same time. That dream I had every day for a week, then twice a week for a month, then I had it 2 or 3 more times, and then I never had that dream again. But when I read the Quran in English translation after the autobiography of Malcolm X, I found the entity and the essence that was on the other side of that wall. I read ayahs like in Surah Al-Hadid, where God is established on the throne. وَمَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ, in the same ayah. That he is established on the throne and with you wherever you are. That he is transcendent and above you. 40 foot thick of concrete doesn't begin to describe the gulf that separates him from you. You will never be him. And yet he's closer to you than your own jugular vein. When I became a PhD and a scholar of Islam and African history, I began to read the great West African and North African scholars, and I came across the line from Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, the great Algerian scholar and also resistance fighter. He resisted French imperialism, and he said, the God that reconciles transcendence with immanence is the God that the messengers commanded us to know. But reason can accept the existence of no such God. Reason can only know a God that is transcendent, not one that is immanent. The dream that I had as a child was God's formulation of a vision that could teach a 7-year-old child what the juxtaposition of transcendence with immanence was. Tanzi and Tashbih, Jalal and Jamal, majesty and beauty. Which brings us to the question, who is Allah? And how do we go about knowing him? God found Malcolm in the darkest places, and that set him on a journey that brought him to the end of his life, seeking to know better that God that had rescued him. Have we undertaken similar efforts to come to know who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is? Have we followed the example of Malcolm X and of Musa, alayhi salatu wassalam, and sought out a teacher that can guide us closer to our destination? Have we humbled ourselves and submitted ourselves to a guide who can inform us and teach us? Because the truth of the matter is that every single person needs a guide if they are going to reach knowledge of Allah. No one can get there by themselves. The way that they say it in West Africa, where I did my PhD research and I've written about this, is even the sharpest knife can't carve its own handle. If the nafs, your lower soul, your ego, is the thing that is broken and preventing you from knowing Allah, how can you use a broken instrument to fix itself? It's an impossibility. You are going to need someone who will guide you through this process. If you are going to draw near to Allah, you can't do it yourself. Because the thing that the human being is most practiced in is self-deception. It's why the Prophet ﷺ, he counseled people. He said, one of the best things you can have is a friend that will tell you the truth about yourself. And if you have no such friends, then keep company with your enemies, because they will be honest with you about your character. The truth of the matter is that even the most debauched degenerate would be a better guide to God for you than you. And fortunately, we don't have to settle for debauched degenerates. There are a number of enlightened guides, people that we can suspect or even know are amongst those awliya that Sister Aisha just mentioned. People like Imam Fode Drame and Sheikh Tijani Sise and Sheikh Mahi Sise and Sheikh Muhammad Sharif and others that are known and others that are hidden. Sit with someone who will help you and guide you. So I'm going to tell some stories about that process of knowing God and seeking help and guidance that come from West Africa, because as I mentioned, it was Malcolm's commitment to Africa that was born in his father's teaching, his father's commitment to the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the movement of Marcus Garvey, that put in Malcolm's heart the idea that we needed to look back to Africa to find examples that would be healing for us here in America. And that's what set me on a course to do a PhD in African history and to teach the history of Islam in Africa for these last 15 years at Northwestern University and University of Michigan. So I can only teach what I know, and what I know comes from West African scholars. Yeah. So in the Hadith of Jibril, which is always the way that the scholars of West Africa begin talking about the path to knowledge of God, we have an excellent, excellent example of how a person is meant to go about seeking spiritual knowledge and how they're supposed to behave with their teachers. We all know the story. I'll give just a brief summary of it. We'll use the narration that comes from Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala an. He says, one day we were sitting with the messenger of God when a man arrived unto us whose clothes were of exceeding whiteness and whose hair was of exceeding blackness. And there were no signs of travel upon him, although he was a stranger to us. He sat down knee to knee opposite the Prophet and placed his palms on the thighs of the Prophet ﷺ and asked him, what is Islam? The Prophet ﷺ answered that it is to testify that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger. It is to establish the prayer, give the alms, fast the month of Ramadan, and make the pilgrimage to the house if you are able. Part of the reason why this is a teaching device in West Africa is because this one hadith provides all the contents of the religion, beginning with the 5 pillars. Then, back to the story, this stranger says, truly spoken, you've answered well. And Umar at this point says, and we were astonished that after having questioned him, he would then confirm him. And you can picture Umar. You know, Umar is a little rough around the edges. First of all, when that man sat down knee to knee next to the Prophet, he was like, am I gonna have to cut this dude? That's the first thing he's thinking. Umar is always ready to go for the sword. And he's getting a little too friendly with the messenger of God. But the Prophet ﷺ modeled for him. The Prophet allowed this, permitted it, responded with affection, so Umar kept his hand off his sword. But he was still upset that this man seemed to be quizzing the Prophet and then confirming him like he's some kind of school child. The story continues. Tell me of Iman, what is faith? And it's interesting, the Prophet ﷺ, his response is an improper definition according to like English rhetoric. When you're given a word to define Iman, you're not supposed to include the word itself in the definition that you offer. But he said it is faith in, because he can't tell you what faith is. Faith is something that has to exist in your heart, but he can tell you what you need to have faith in. God, his angels, his books, his messengers, the hour, and the decree. 5 pillars and 6 articles of faith. things that we have to believe in, and we have to seek knowledge about those things. The things that are on the outer level, the things that are at the level of Islam, are all about the movement of the limbs. It's about praying at certain times, moving your body to Hajj at certain times, sometimes putting things into your body, sometimes keeping things out of your body, like when we're fasting now. That's an external level. It's at the level of the limbs. The Islam that comes at the next level of Iman is about understanding. It's about things that you cannot observe with your eyes. You have to believe in the unseen. You have to believe in things that you can't see with the eye of the body. Again, the stranger confirms the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Finally, he asks, what is ihsan? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, it is to worship God as though you see him. And if you don't see him, knowing that he sees you. Again, he has answered well. We won't talk about the hour for the moment, just in the interest of time, but we're going to expand upon these pieces. When Umar finishes the narration, he says, I stayed a while after the stranger had left, and then the Prophet ﷺ asked me, Omar, do you know who that man was? The stranger, do you know who he was? And he said, God and his messenger know best. And he said, that was Gabriel. He came to teach you your religion. The angel Gabriel came and put on this demonstration with the Prophet ﷺ participating in the demonstration. The Prophet ﷺ knows the whole time exactly who it is, but no one else that's there at that time does. And he ﷺ is modeling for us the adab, the etiquette that the disciple is supposed to have with their teacher. Because whoever teaches you so much as a letter of the Quran, they are your master. And Jibril taught the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ, so in spite of the fact that the Messenger of God has a spiritual station that is superior to that of Jibril, he shows the submissive docility and humility that the seeker of knowledge is supposed to have with their teacher, with their sheikh. The same way that Musa fell just a little short of having that same adab with Sayyidina Khidr. Musa's spiritual station is superior to that of Khidr. He is one of the 5 prophets of Azm, of resolute determination. His rank is above that of Khidr. But Khidr has a knowledge that he doesn't have, so he submits himself to that teaching. The rank of the Prophet ﷺ is better than that of Jibril, and yet he submits. Have we submitted? Have we sought out teachers that can guide us to Islam, Iman, and most especially Ihsan? That can guide us to that worship where you become aware of God's presence in everything. That same scholar, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, that I just mentioned a moment ago, said that the knowers of God understand that God is present in every created thing without khulul and without ittihad, without indwelling and without fusion. God is always present in everything. If you don't see him in your interactions with your neighbors, if you don't see him in your interaction with your families, with your teachers, even with people who seem to be enemies to you, you're missing God's personalized performance of his beauty and his majesty for you, his transcendence and his immanence for you. His specially designed lesson for you, because there was nobody there other than Allah. Who is teaching you other than Allah? Who is designing the lesson plan other than Allah? Worshiping God while you see him means seeing him in everything, and knowing that if you don't see him, that he sees you. The great scholar of Islam from West Africa, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, may Allah have mercy on him, complete his works, 20th century scholar, described a debate, a theological debate that he had with a Saudi scholar when he made the pilgrimage in the 1960s. He said this mufti was following me while I was trying to make tawaf around the house. And he finally cornered me when I was sitting down, and he said, as for us, we are of the opinion that one that doesn't say that God is jalasa ala al-arsh, seated upon the throne, that person is deficient in their belief or even an unbeliever. Shaykh Ibrahim says, we seek refuge in Allah from what he said, but he actually said seated upon the throne, as if God has a buttocks. Instead of istawa al-arsh. We're back to that throne as the image of majesty. And this is one of the places where the rationalists, the people that think just with the mind, instead of appreciating God's intimacy, they can only imagine a distant, powerful God sitting on a throne. So they'll say, they'll ask you, where is God? And if you don't say he's on the throne, they'll say you're deficient in your belief. So Shaykh Ibrahim says to him, he says, I've seen in this Quran that Allah mentions his arsh, his throne, 10 times, and he mentions his kursi 1 time. So there's 11 references to this throne, and we for sure believe in that. He also says that he has a house, and here we are seated right next to his house right now. But if you were to go into Allah's house right now, would you find him inside? The man said no. He said, okay. He said, we're also informed that Allah has a she-camel, a camel. This is the she-camel of Allah. Give her to drink. It's in the story of Saleh. He said, so we know that Allah has a camel, but have you ever seen God riding a camel? The man said, of course not. He said, okay. He said, well, if it's the custom of people to be found sometimes upon their mounts and sometimes within their homes, but if you were to go to God's camel into God's house, you might not find him on top or inside. Isn't it possible that at any given moment you might not find him on the throne? The man was flummoxed and didn't know what to say. So then he was quiet for a long time, and he said, fine, what do you do with the hadith that says that in the last third of the night, God descends to answer the supplication of the one who calls to give forgiveness to the one who asks forgiveness? Surely this descent is an indication that he's on the throne and coming down. And Shaykh Ibrahim says, we believe in that. We rise in the last part of the night and we ask our Lord for forgiveness, and we call upon him to fulfill every last one of our needs. We for sure believe in that hadith. Nazala, the descent. He said, but God also uses the same word, nazala, to say that that he descends upon us 8 kinds of livestock. This is in Surah Al-An'am. 2 of the cattle kind, 2 of the oxen kind, 2 of the sheep kind, and 2 of the goat kind, camel kind. We see, God speaks of the descent of these, but we see their mothers giving birth to them every day. So what is the meaning of the descent of these 8 kinds of livestock? And the man says, the truth is we don't understand what is meant by the descent of these livestock. He said, if you don't understand the descent of camels, how can you understand the descent of your Lord? No. Now, what is the point of this long discursus into Shaykh Ibrahim Nias's debate with a Saudi mufti? Is that if you start reasoning in human terms about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, you're guaranteed to arrive at distortion. If you only magnify the majesty and don't understand the beauty and the intimacy of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that he is established on the throne and with you wherever you are. When we were mentioned that Sayyidina Musa, when he's sent to Pharaoh, he doesn't initially want to go. He says, we're afraid that he might hasten against us or transgress. After all, God just called him a transgressor. This is in Surah Taha. And God says, go, I'm with you, I see and I hear. God is with you, he is present, he is intimate, he is near, and he is transcendent. And that thing is something that the reason cannot find a way to encompass, to understand. If you try to squeeze God between your ears and you arrive at some kind of understanding in that way, then you have made your intellect the God of God. Whereas, in fact, God's knowledge encompasses everything, and he gives nothing of his knowledge except by his permission. The truth of the matter is that when you start at that outer level of Islam with submission of the limbs, that corresponds to an effort to understand who God is by observing his signs in the world. That outer level of Islam is the equivalent of paying attention to the signs, reading the eyes of the Quran, looking in the signs in the heavens and the earth. We shall show them signs in the horizon and within themselves until they know that he is the truth or the real. You learn something about a painter by looking at their paintings. There's a deeper level of understanding that comes with an immersion in the attributes, those names of beauty and majesty, those adjectives that God uses as descriptors to describe himself. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate, the giver of life, the bringer of death. Those reconciliations of opposites that we talked about, although notice that Rahman and Rahim are juxtapositions of one another. Whereas often names exist in opposites, God is never the opposite of merciful. A name of mercy can only be matched with a name of mercy. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. But this too is an intellectual exercise. You can know a superior access of knowledge to God through this, but that final level of knowledge to God that corresponds with the level of ihsan is worshiping God while seeing him. That comes through God's unveiling of direct knowledge to you. That's not the level of knowledge at the signs nor of the attributes. That is a level of knowledge that comes from the essence itself. And if you think for a moment that that is a thing that is only gifted to the prophets of God, peace be upon all of them, I bring glad tidings in the sense of your soul and bad news with respect to your opinion. The fact of the matter is that those inspirations did not stop with the prophets. The time of ilham, the time of direct inspiration, the time of God's direct tutelage for the human being never ends. The messenger of God, alayhi afdal salatu wassalam, the best of creation, said, when I am gone, nothing will be left of nubuwwah, of prophethood, except for the mubashirat, the glad tidings. They said, Messenger of God, what are these glad tidings? He said, Arruya as-salihah, which is often translated as the true dreams of the righteous, but this is not accurate. First of all, it's not a dream. There's a perfectly good word for dreams in Arabic, but ruya is a vision. A vision encompasses what is seen in states of sleep and what's seen in states of waking. The inspiration that can come doesn't just come when your eyes are closed. And it's the visions of the righteous or the righteous visions. It can work either way grammatically. That is a period of time that never ends, but how do you arrive at that station where the knowledge is no longer analytical and abstract, but direct and immediate? How do you arrive in that space where, like I did, when I reached the age of 43 years old, that I had that dream again where I was back in that space where I had been traveling since the beginning of time. When I was a kid, I thought it was space, but there were no stars in it. There were never any stars in it. It was pre-eternity the whole time. And when I set myself on a path and got a teacher and began spiritual training for the first time in my life since I was 7 years old, I had that dream again. And this time the wall was gone. And this is a story, I shouldn't even tell this story with the cameras running, but I'm going to tell the story with the cameras running, no less. In that dream, in this empty space, this space with no stars in it, gold stardust started to shape itself into the form of Arabic letters. And I started to try to read the letters. Kahayya, kahayya, I couldn't make it into a word. And then the voice spoke. Kaf, haya, ayn, sad. ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا إذ نادى ربه نداء خفيا. Surah Maryam read itself out from beginning to end. And I did not know Surah Maryam. In fact, when I called my sheikh, I didn't know what surah it was. I said it's the one that starts Kaf Ha Ya Ain Sad because that's what I knew, just what I had seen in the dream. The truth of the matter is that these true visions are still available to us. When the Quran was sent down, do you think it got sent back? What are we commemorating in this month of Ramadan except the descent of this Quran? For sure, it is still there. ready to come down on the heart of any person who will rid themselves of their attachments to this world, who will struggle against their four enemies, and we're going to get to the four enemies in just a moment, and commit themselves to the way of Allah. That book can still come down on your heart for sure. It's still there. And we're all going to be up in odd-numbered nights in the last 10 days of Ramadan looking for Laylatul Qadr. But I, BILAL, WARE, testify before you that the day that the Quran begins to speak to you, the day that it comes down on your heart, that is your Laylatul Qadr. Find your Laylatul Qadr. Find your Laylatul Qadr. Now, how are we going to do this? We got to find a teacher. Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, the great scholar I mentioned before, tells in his excellent treatise, Kashful al-Bas, The Removal of Confusion, he describes all of the pitfalls of finding a bad teacher. Someone who's corrupt and of poor morals, the debauched degenerate that I mentioned earlier. And so he gives warnings about this, and then he describes all of the excellent characteristics that are required in a consummate teacher. And when he gets to the end, he says, you might be wondering where you'll ever find such a person. Surely they must be more difficult to find than the mythical anqa, which is like it's like a griffin or a phoenix. It's some kind of mythical bird. Like, surely you'll never find such a person. Then Shaykh Ibrahim continues, he said, but the truth of the matter is you don't need to know where you'll find such a person. As soon as you need a teacher, the way that a mother that has lost her child in the desert needs to find that child. As soon as you need a teacher, the way that a man who's dying of thirst in the desert needs water, your teacher will present themselves to you. As soon as you have sincerity, in other words, in understanding that this is no game, that our day of judgment is coming at any moment. None of us knows whether we're going to see tomorrow, much less next year's Ramadan. And if you do not reach the place where God begins teaching you directly from His knowledge, how will you know that it is Him that you have been worshiping this whole time, rather than some abstraction that you constructed between your ears? The great 9th century Nubian scholar, East African scholar, Dhulnun al-Misri, said, whatever your intellect can conceive or your imagination can imagine, know that Allah is not that. I mean, think about it. We're back where we started. You would have made one of God's created entities into the God of God. Surely the God that reveals Himself to you after you've set yourself on this road and sought out a teacher and purified yourself of these four enemies that we're going to discuss, that is the one. There's the great North African Sufian scholar, Ahmed Tijan Sharif, may Allah have mercy on him, complete his works. He said that the one that dies without ma'rifah, without direct unveiling, risks dying in a state of unbelief and being unaware of it. Why? Because if all of your deeds are invalidated, if they do not meet the conditions of ikhlas, of sincerity, of being performed exclusively for the sake of God, then they're not any good for you. And yet, how do you know it's God that you've been worshiping? Until He Himself confirms for you. Until He Himself reveals to you knowledge that you didn't have and couldn't have, so that you know for sure it is the truth. We shall show them signs on the horizon and within themselves until they know that He is the real. And you can take another way of thinking about who is God, this question of knowledge of God that Malcolm started me on that we can talk about, is take any one of those 99 names, those attributes, and plug it into the Shahada, and you will have a factual statement. There is no God but God. There is no real but the real. There is no truth but the truth. Tabaraka wa ta'ala. Period. So, we set out in sincerity, we seek out a teacher, we seek out a guide, and invariably, in all of the different paths. They're going to cause us to confront our four enemies. Sister Aisha talked about fear and grief. We won't have time to come back to those. It's an excellent exposition. I'll just point you to a YouTube video by Imam Fode Drame, the great Gambian scholar, where he talks about fear and grief in some great detail. You can find it. It's called Diseases of the Nafs. But we'll talk about these four enemies, and we'll use a mechanism that was gifted to us by another one of the great West African scholars, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, a man who wrote more than 200 works in the Arabic language, some of them collections of as many as 200 poems, some of those poems as many as 5,000 verses. Just run the numbers real quick. This is a man who wrote obsessively, and almost all of his writing in the second part of his life was devotional poetry praising the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Madih, only Madih, basically from 1902 all the way till the time he passed in 1927, the last 25 years of his life, he didn't write anything but poetry praising the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. He had already written theology and law, but the only thing that was worth him moving his pen in the later part of his life was finding praise for the best of creation, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this great scholar gave us a roadmap to how we can advance in these spiritual ranks. They are the four principal enemies of the growth of the human soul, as outlined by Imam Ghazali and a number of other teachers. These are the nafs, the shaitan, the hawa, and the dunya. The lower soul, the ego, the devil himself, the caprices of the whims, and worldliness, and the dunya, the world. But something that had never happened in the history of Islamic scholarship happened for this great West African scholar, Ahmadou Bamba. He reduced these to a simple mnemonic device by taking the first letter of each one of the enemies, and it became nashahadu. We bear witness. We bear witness that the four enemies of the growth of the human soul are the nafs, the shaitan, the hawa, and the dunya. And then he provided a detailed teaching so that you could understand what an attack from each one of these specific enemies looks like and how to defend yourself against it. We begin with the nafs, and we'll move quickly through these in the interest of time. Try to have this wrapped up by midnight, inshallah. In Surah, so we'll start with the nafs. In Surah Al-Naziat, there's a detail in the story of Moses, alayhi salatu wasalam, that doesn't occur in any of the other tellings of Moses' story in Quran. And the telling of Moses' story are many. Moses is the most frequently mentioned name in the Quran, in point of fact. And there's important lessons in that, but we'll come back to those. In this particular telling, when Moses goes to Pharaoh, he says to him, would you allow yourself to be purified that I might guide you to your Lord? Would you allow yourself to be purified that I might guide you to your Lord? And Pharaoh's response is to turn his back and to gather up his people and to call them together and says, indeed, I am your Lord Most High. And I'm here to tell you that the parable of the nafs in the Quran is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the embodiment of human evil in the Quran. And Pharaoh's sin is that he says, I am your Lord God Most High, worship none but me, and that is the role of the ego and the lower soul within the human being. It gives the command and we obey. It gives the command and we obey. In Surah Yusuf, the nafs in this unrepaired state is addressed by the wife of El-Aziz. She says, indeed, the nafs is persistently enjoining towards evil, amaratun bisu, except for the one on whom the Lord has mercy. What is this mercy that she's referring to? Who is this mercy that she is referring to? The mercy to all the worlds is the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and all of the messengers that came before him were also mercies. The mercy comes with guidance from another human being. That's why Moses tells Pharaoh, would you allow yourself, your nafs, to be purified that I might guide you to your Lord? Take a teacher. I can get you out of this mess you put yourself in. But the ego is too proud. It refuses to submit. And how many of us have been too proud to submit to somebody who we knew was giving us life-saving knowledge? Do I have to raise my hand? Will I be the only one? That submission, that taking yourself lightly so that you can rise, is the way that you say it in Wolof. That's what allows a person to set themselves on that spiritual path and to begin to struggle against the nafs, because you can't struggle against the nafs by yourself. You have a perfectly designed prison. Your ego will always give you some excuse that will keep you from confronting the challenge that's going to kill it. And most of what we think is us is just the chattering of our nafs, trying to justify for us commands that it has already given. I am your Lord Most High, worship none but me. Indeed, I know for you no other God than me. That's the other version of what Pharaoh says. And that's what the nafs is saying inside of all of us. So until we allow ourselves to be purified and guided, we're stuck in that first stage. So the beauty of the West African teaching model is that no physician, no useful physician gives a diagnosis without also providing a remedy, right? So now you know what the attack from the nafs looks like, but what's the treatment? The direct treatment is fasting. Because fasting starves the nafs into submission. We can already feel it as the month of Ramadan begins. That barking inside us starts to get quieter and quieter. He's just too tired. You're not feeding him. The nafs is made out of fire. The same way that the hellfire is made out of fire. And it's going to take the foot of Al-Jabbar to put out the hellfire. It's going to keep saying Hal min Mazid until the foot of Al-Jabbar stamps out the hellfire, and the nafs is made from that same stuff. The more you feed it with what it wants, just like a fire, the bigger it grows. Cut off its source of oxygen. Starve it. And watch it lose its power over you. But you're going to need someone else's assistance in this process. You can't do it by yourself. It's a progression. Nafs, shaitan, hawa dunya. The reason why the shaitan comes next is because with God as my witness, the shaitan barely has to bother with you until you've started to overcome your nafs, because as long as your nafs is in an unreformed state, you are your own shaitan. You are your own shaitan. Listen, the shaitan has limited resources. He doesn't have unlimited armies. So he sends lesser devils amongst jinn and amongst human beings to give you the slightest provocation. And if your nafs is in an unredeemed state, unreformed state, that's going to get you sent to the pen. Can I get a witness? So once you've started to set yourself free from the prison of the nafs, that's when the shayateen really come after you. Because you are now on the verge of becoming a threat. Now he's got to commit more serious resources to you. And again, his resources are not unlimited. He's weak. Described repeatedly as weak. He can only fight you with the weapons that you give him. This is another topic, but I'm going to mention it just because it's significant. The Quran always describes the shaitan as weak. The Prophet ﷺ never described the Dajjal as weak. Dajjal. He described him as the greatest fitna. So be prepared. He fights with weapons, not just yours, the ones you give him. May Allah make us part of the preparation for his inevitable defeat. So back to the shaitan. In a wonderful book called Masalik al-Janan, The Pathways of Paradise, Ahmadu Bamba talks about this, the shaitan. And he says, never forget that the shaitan is only a dog set upon you by a master. When you get attacked by a dog, you don't yell at the dog. You call out for help from the master. When the Iblis rebels, when he refuses to bow to that which God made with his own two hands, is God surprised? He encompasses everything in his knowledge. He for sure is not surprised, which means he created the shaitan knowing full well that he was going to go that route, which means that he is only doing exactly what God intends for him to be doing. He's serving the role in the cosmic drama that God intends for him to serve. He is a dog at the end of a leash. When you get attacked by a dog, you can yell at the dog all day and watch that dog take chunks out of your behind. Sorry, I said behind. In the masjid, I didn't want to say something else. Call out for help from the master. Dhikr. Use those names. Call out by those most beautiful names. Ask for God's help. Why do you think he made that dog? Except that he wants you to call upon him. And he knows that if you thought yourself self-sufficient, you wouldn't call. Call out on him by those beautiful names and he will pull that chain and he will choke that dog. He will get that dog off of you. And especially the names that come in the most common triad in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Allah Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. People ignore the fact that the basmala itself, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, is one of the most powerful adhkar, one of the most powerful forms of dhikr in the Quran, because it contains those names of mercy and God's own personal name. And in Surah Zukhruf, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, the one that abandons, the one that turns blind from dhikr ar-Rahman, from dhikr ar-Rahman, so from remembrance of the merciful, or dhikr with the name the merciful, God assigns for him a shaitan as a qareen, as a constant companion, and he believes that he is guided while he's misguided. Are you using that name, ar-Rahman, each day as dhikr? Or are you one of the ones potentially that's addressed in Surah Zukhruf? That if you've abandoned dhikr Rahman, that you think that you're guided, but in fact you've got somebody whispering to keep you off track, to keep you from becoming your best self, to keep you from achieving the spiritual station. What is wilaya that Sister Aisha was mentioning? She talked about the friends of God, which is an excellent way of discussing it. The precise linguistic definition is not friendship, but rather alliance. These are God's allies. They do the work that he sets out for them. They are in alliance with God. God ain't got no partners, but he's got allies. He's got allies. They're the ones that neither fear nor grieve. How do you enter into those ranks except by setting yourself on this spiritual journey? And the ones, the angels give glad tidings to those aliyah, saying, "Fear not, neither grieve. We are your allies in this, in the dunya and in the akhirah." That's Quran. So the one that is engaged in remembrance and becomes the ally of God, the angels are their companions and their allies, and the one that abandons dhikr, the shayateen, are their allies. And dhikr, which corresponds to this refutation of the shaitan, is the one always binding Quranic injunction upon humanity. Every other form of worship comes with times that it is forbidden, conditions of body that it's forbidden, places that are involved. Everything else comes with condition, not dhikr. There is never any time when dhikr is forbidden to you. And if there's never a time when it's forbidden, that means God is telling you need to be doing this all the time. That's the only reason why you were. And think about how the Quran talks about dhikr. It's always just dhikr kathira. Lots. Never specification, never fixing a number. Use those names, call out to the master, and he will choke that dog, get that dog off of you, and you will feel those shayateen being plucked off of you. Not just the invisible ones, But the ones that are human beings in your social relationships, they'll also start to just fall off as you start to ascend. As you start to ascend, then you'll encounter the struggle against the caprices or the desires, hawa. It's closely related to shahwat. And subhanAllah, I just noticed this reading Quran since a few weeks ago. They're also mentioned in Surah Al-Naziyat, actually. The nafs and the hawa are mentioned at the very end of the same surah where Pharaoh says what he says and where Moses says, would you be purified and guided? So there's a close relationship between these two. And this has to do with emotionality and caprice and whim. And the treatment that comes for the attacks from this is fasting of the tongue and fasting of the genitals. That's how you control excessive emotionality according to the way that Ahmadu Bamba explains it. The reason, of course, well, we can talk about the genitals separately. That's obvious why that would help you control emotionality and excess and caprice and women desire. The fasting of the tongue is also highly recommended. There are 2 fasts of the tongue that occur in Surah Maryam, the 3-day fast of Zechariah and the 1-day fast of Mary. Both are excellent fasts in order to get control of your emotions and get control of your caprices. And all of this goes back to the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he says, if a believer guarantees me 2 parts of the body, I'll guarantee them Jannah. And they said, which 2 are these? He said, the part between the teeth and the part between the thighs. If you can learn to control those, then you're going to keep yourself out of the fire if you have belief. He said, if a believer guarantees me these. If you have iman and you control those 2, then you'll at least get the lowest level of paradise. Which nobody in paradise is disappointed. The lowest level of paradise is plenty good. But for us that are here together in this room, we want Allah's ridwan. Jannatul Firdaus won't even be good enough for us. We want Allah's ridwan, His pleasure, which is having access to His face for all of eternity at our volition. The residents of all the other gardens, including Jannatul Firdaus, God appears there occasionally. But the people of Ridwan have access to His everlasting and blessed face for all eternity. It's never absent from them. May Allah give us Allah. May Allah give us Allah. What is better than that? So controlling these 2 organs, the fasting of the tongue is critical, and I'll just put it to you this way. When have you ever been carried away by your emotions except that it was your tongue that carried you there? My wife and I have been together, alhamdulillah, for 25 years now. And I can tell you that like all of those incidents that, led to me sleeping on the couch, it was because I had to say that one last thing. And my wife is a good and patient woman. But when you gotta say that one last thing and you can't hold your tongue, you end up sleeping on your prayer mat. Can I get an amen? So some of the brothers are like, so undertaking the fast from speech is an excellent, and you learn to understand the harm that words can do, not just to others, but to yourself. But to yourself, to your own soul, to your own progress, to your own growth. And finally, the dunya. And this is perhaps the most characteristic challenge of our age, because we live in a late capitalist consumer society that is constantly inciting you to acquisitiveness, that is pushing you and compelling you towards greed, that is causing you to measure yourself and your achievements in the number or nature of your possessions. When the fact of the matter is that nothing in this created world has any intrinsic value. The great 20th century, he passed away, may Allah have mercy on him, complete his work, Sheikh Hassan Sise used to make a supplication He said, Allah, fill our hearts with you and our hands with the dunya. The truth of the matter is that for a person who can break the world's heartstrings on them, then material possessions are safe in their hands. But if you still have attachment to worldly things, then all the possessions in the world are nothing but a trial and a torment for you. And if God has kept you broke, consider it a mercy. Because it's a sign that He loves you and does not want to inflict possessions upon you until you have broken your last heartstrings with them. And if you want to have affluence in this world and success in the next, then give up any personal investment in any worldly thing. The way that Ahmadu Bamba puts it in Masalikul Janan, he says that he said, wash your hands of it and detach your heart from it and purify thereby your worship. The truth is that as long as you are attached to anything in this dunya, your worship will be deficient. Because you will have erected a God in competition with God. The only way to free ourselves from that is to understand that it is all going back to God. None of us hold any of it. The Prophet ﷺ said, the inhabitants of the graves all long for the same thing. One day with which they could accomplish some good deed that is of benefit to them where they are now. And when I first heard that, after I came into Islam, I said to myself, subhanAllah, I have the thing that every human being that has ever lived and died would give up everything they ever owned to possess. I have today. I have today with which I can accomplish some beneficial deed that will be of use to me where I'm headed. Whereas those goods are not going to be of any use to you where you're headed until you've given up any attachment to them, and therefore when God gives you any good thing of this world, you only use it for good. And know that gratitude in affluence, gratitude with wealth is better than patience in poverty. But it's harder. It's harder to sustain and maintain. Your heart has to be purified from attachment to the dunya. And the last part of the attachment to the dunya that I'll mention, and then we'll close, inshallah ta'ala, is riya or hubb riyasa, ostentation, showing off. And this is also to be classed with the attack from the dunya, because it is seeking approval of others through your worship, rather than seeking Allah's pleasure. And the great scholar Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, the great Qadri scholar from northern Nigeria, he said that this is one of the most dangerous of the defects of character, blameworthy traits of character, because not only does it rob the worshiper of the good in their acts of worship, but it actually accumulates sin for them. It doesn't just take away the benefit of the deed when you violate the conditions of ikhlas. But when you do it so that someone else will be pleased with you, then it's shirk. And now it counts against you. And then he continues, he says in the Kitab al-Mu'amalat, he said, pleasing people is a goal that you will never attain. How much more foolish then to try to attain it in exchange for God's wrath? Right? I mean, we go back to Bob Marley, you know. You could tap the water till the well run dry. No matter how you treat him, a man will never be satisfied. Could you be loved? Could you? Seriously, you'll never please human beings. You'll never please them. So you're exteriorizing the performance of your faith for them will only lead to perdition. If we can struggle against these four enemies on a road that has been traveled by a teacher who knows that way by day and by night, by rain and by shine, then we can enter into the ranks of those who have neither fear nor grief upon them, either in this world or in the next. And I'm here to tell you that it's not something that is only for people of previous generations. It's not something that is it's cut off to you if you have limited education, if you don't speak the Arabic language. Look at the example of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, the station that God raised him to, and the place that he originally found him in. There is no corner so dark that God can't find you there and raise you to the ranks of his most beloved servants if you have sincerity in seeking out knowledge, and seeking out knowledge from human teachers who will be of benefit to you. Because it's part of God's mercy and blessing to humanity that he uses human beings to guide other human beings. Because he multiplies the blessing for the guide and the guided by using human beings to teach other human beings. And it causes us to come together in love for one another and in service to one another. May Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala put blessing and light in this month. May he accept and complete the deeds of our forefather, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. May he accept him amongst the ranks of the martyrs and amongst the awliya. May he make every single person who came to this gathering burdened with something of sin be relieved of that burden of sin for all eternity. For each person that came to this gathering bearing something of illness, whether it's illness in the heart or illness in the body, may Allah give them full and complete and total shifa. May Allah return them to a state of wellness. May Allah find every last one of us tomorrow morning in the best spiritual station that we have ever occupied. And when Allah finds us in that best spiritual station that we've ever occupied, may he remake for us every supplication we have ever made in our lives from that new state that he finds us in. And may the next day find us in a better state than that, and may he repeat the exercise and answer every prayer from our new station in perpetuity, so that we can accelerate on the path of his beloved messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is drawing nearer to Allah. So may we speed up so that we can keep up with him, alayhi afdal salatu wasalam, so that we can draw near to him, so that we can draw near to the one who sent him. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sorry, it's a little long. So with those